September 14th, 1724. The sea's been a devil the past week, thrashing us about like a toy ship in a child's tub. We've weathered storms that would have sent lesser men straight to Davy Jones' locker, and all whilst dodging the king's ships, their cannons hungry for the taste of our hull. It seems His Majesty's Navy hasn't forgotten the years I've served in their ranks. Ironic how the very skills they've taught me have become their bane. But fortune, fickle as she may be, has smiled upon us. Word reached us in the dead of night, carried by a ragged merchant who was more than willing to share secrets in exchange for his life. A fat merchant ship, East India Trading Company, ripe for the taking. She's laden with silks, spices, and enough gold to buy our freedom 10 times over, if freedom is what we sought. The crew is restless with anticipation, and I can't deny that I share in their bloodlust. This could be our salvation, a prize that could set us up for years, far from the reach of the crown and its laws. Or it could be the end of us, another tale of fools who flew too close to the sun. For now I'll let the wind fill our sails and the salt air sharpen our senses. For soon we hunt. September 15th, 1724. Dawn broke calm and clear, a welcome change from the squalls of the past days. I stepped onto the deck, breathing in the salt air, and for the first time in weeks felt a semblance of peace. The peace was shattered moments later when the smell of cooking meat wafted towards me. Too rich and greasy for the usual morning fare. I followed the scent to the galley, and there, hunched over a small fire with a guilty look plastered across his face, was young Jacobs. In his pan, sizzling away, was none other than an albatross, its white feathers still scattered around the deck. "You bloody fool!" I roared, startling him so bad he nearly tipped over the pan.
"Do you have any idea what you've done? Killing a seabird! Have you lost your senses?"
Jacob stammered, his hands trembling as he tried to offer some half-baked excuse. But I cut him off.
"That bird is a sacred omen of the seas. You've invited bad luck upon us all!"
The words echoed in the air, heavy with the weight of centuries of superstition. He paled and quickly offered the bird up, but it was too late. I snatched it from his hands and glared at him, my fury barely in check. "If we are cursed because of this, it will be on your head," I growled, shoving the charred remains into a cloth. Storming off, I made my way to the stern where the ship's cat lounged in its usual spot. Licking its paws with the casual indifference only a cat could muster, I tossed the dead albatross in front of it, hoping to put the ill omen to rest in the only way I knew how. The cat perked up at the sight of the offering, sniffing the air, and for a moment I thought the curse might yet be avoided. It rose, took a few hesitant steps forward towards me and the bird, then stopped. For a long moment it stared at the albatross, as if seeing something the rest of us couldn't. Then, with a flick of its tail, it turned and padded away, leaving the bird untouched. A chill ran down my spine, colder than any gust of wind. I'd seen many omens in my time at sea, but never 2 in a row. The crew mustn't know. Not yet. They're restless enough as it is. Let us hope these are just silly superstitions. But I fear the winds are about to turn, and not in our favour. September 16th, 1724. The morning haze had barely lifted when we spotted the merchant vessel on the horizon. Her sails full and billowing, cutting a steady path through the waves. From the look of her, she was just as the merchant had described, a fat East Indiaman, plodding along like a cow waiting for the slaughter. Our approach was swift and silent, the men moving with a practiced efficiency that even I, once an officer of His Majesty's Navy, had to admire. The ominous tension of the previous day clung to us, but no one dared voice their unease. We were privateers, after all. Superstition be damned. A prize like this could not be ignored. As we drew alongside, the first inklings of something amiss began to gnaw at me. There was no cry of alarm from the merchant ship, no frantic scrambling of men on deck. Instead, we heard only the creak of the ship's timbers and the eerie whistle of the wind through their rigging. The usual rush of battle lust was tainted with an undercurrent of doubt.
"Prepare to board!"
I barked, trying my best to dispel the growing sense of unease. Grappling hooks flew, ropes tightened, and with a shout we leaped onto their deck, weapons drawn. The first thing that struck me was the stench. A sickly sweet smell that clung to the air, mixing with the salt of the sea. The second was the sight of the crew. They were skittish, their eyes wide with fear, but not the kind of fear we were accustomed to. This wasn't the panic of men facing a band of cutthroats. It was something deeper, more primal. There were far fewer of them than I'd anticipated, too. Barely a dozen souls, when a ship like this should have boasted a crew of at least 50. Those who remained offered little resistance. They dropped their weapons almost immediately, hands trembling as they were bound and shoved to their knees. No cries for mercy, no desperate pleas, just hollow-eyed resignation. I scanned the deck, my instincts on edge.
"Search the hold,"
I ordered. The men moved quickly, disappearing below the deck, whilst I paced, unease gnawing at my sides. There was something wrong on this ship, something that went beyond our usual raids and plunder. Minutes later, my quartermaster, Black Jack, emerged from the hold, his face ashen. He looked like he had stared into the abyss itself.
"Captain, you need to see this."
I followed him below, the stench growing stronger with every step. When we reached the cargo hold, the scent that greeted me turned my stomach. There were bodies, dozens of them, stacked like firewood in the shadows. Some were dressed in the garb of the merchants, others in the rags of common sailors. Their skin had gone waxy and pale, eyes frozen in an expression of terror, lips curled back to reveal teeth clenched in their final agony. The cause of death wasn't immediately apparent, though most had begun to rot, leaving their potential wounds hard to identify as such. But the way they were laid out, almost ritualistically, sent a shiver through me. Among the corpses were crates of spices, their lids half opened, spilling cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg onto the floor. The contrast between the rich, exotic scents and the stench of decay was nauseating. This was no ordinary shipment. Something sinister had happened here. "What in God's name?" I muttered, my voice barely more than a whisper. I then turned to Black Jack, who had been in more than his fair share of bloody engagements, but he had looked shaken. "What did the crew say?"
"Not much, Captain. They ain't talking. Just sitting there with that same cursed look in their eyes," he replied, his voice low. "Whatever happened here, it's broken them."
I stood there for a long moment, staring at the lifeless bodies and trying to make sense of it all. We'd come expecting gold, riches, perhaps even a fight, but this was something far darker than I'd bargained for.
"Get back to the deck,"
I finally said, my voice tight.
"We'll take what little is worth having and leave this cursed ship to the sea. And for God's sake, tell my men to stay sharp."
As we made our way back up, I could feel the weight of the Albatross's curse hanging over me like a storm cloud. Surely this bad luck was because of it,
or at least what my crewmate had done. The ship we boarded was no treasure trove, no salvation. It was a tomb, and I had a feeling that whatever had claimed the lives of its crew wasn't finished yet. We made our way back to the deck, the silence of the ship weighing heavy on my shoulders. The wind had died down, leaving an oppressive stillness in the air that made every creak of the timber sound like a gunshot. The men worked quickly, eager to be away from this accursed vessel, hauling what few crates of spices they could salvage. I was about to climb back over the railing when I noticed something odd. Johnson, one of the men tasked with retrieving the spices from below, was lagging behind. He had his hands clutched to his chest, and even in the dim light, I could see the dark stain of blood seeping through his fingers.
"Johnson!"
I called out, my voice sharp.
"What happened to you?"
He flinched at the sound of his name, quickly tucking his hand into his coat, as if to hide it.
"It's nothing, Captain,"
he mumbled, eyes darting nervously around the deck.
"Just a scrape is all."
I frowned, stepping closer. Johnson was a wiry, seasoned sailor, no stranger to wounds, and certainly not the type to get skittish over a scratch.
"Let me see,"
I demanded, grabbing his arm before he could protest. He hesitated, but under my glare he slowly pulled his hand from his coat. His palm was slick with blood, and as I examined it, I saw several deep, jagged cuts running across his fingers. The wound looked fresh, the blood still bright and wet.
"Just a scrape, eh?"
I muttered, my tone laced with suspicion.
"How did this happen?"
Johnson swallowed hard, glancing back toward the hatch leading below the deck. His reluctance was palpable.
It was the crates, Captain. When we were moving them, one slipped and caught my hand on a nail. Or maybe it was a shard of wood. It's nothing serious."
His expression didn't sit right with me. The cuts on his hand were too clean, too precise to be the work of a splinter or a nail, and the way he avoided my gaze, like a child caught in a lie. It only made my unease grow. "Johnson," I said, lowering my voice so the others wouldn't hear. "What aren't you telling me? Did you see something down there?" For a moment he just stared at me, his face pale and drawn. Then, almost imperceptibly, he shook his head.
"No, Captain. Just the bodies. Nothing else."
I narrowed my eyes, but didn't press further. Whatever had caused those cuts, whatever had spooked him, he wasn't going to speak of it. Not now, at least.
"Get that hand wrapped up," I said, stepping back, "and keep your eyes about you. We're leaving this cursed place as soon as we can."
He nodded quickly, relief flooding his features as he turned and hurried off towards the surgeon's quarters. I watched him go, my mind churning. The dead bodies below, the stench of decay, the eerie silence of the ship, and now this blood, fear, and secrets. I climbed back aboard our own ship, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on me. The men were moving fast, eager to set sail and put distance between us and this ghostly vessel. I couldn't blame them. But as I looked across the deck at the evening sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever evil had taken root on that ship found its way aboard ours as well. September 17th, 1724. The night was unnervingly calm, the ship gently rocking as it cut through the dark waters. After the horrors of the day before, I had hoped for some rest, but sleep came fitfully, interrupted by uneasy dreams and the ever-present weight of foreboding that had settled over the crew. It was well past midnight when I was jolted awake by a commotion below deck.
Voices raised in alarm, the sound of men shuffling about, and a low guttural groaning that sent a chill down my spine. For a moment I lay still, hoping it was nothing more than the usual drunken scuffle, or some poor soul suffering from a nightmare. But as the noise grew louder, I knew better. Something was wrong. I threw on my coat and made my way down the narrow stairway to the lower deck. The stench of stale air and sweat thick in the confined space. When I reached the main hold, I found a group of men clustered together, their faces pale in the dim light of the lanterns that swung with the motion of the ship. "Captain!" Black Jack spotted me first, stepping aside to let me through. The men parted, revealing the source of the disturbance. It was Johnson, the man whose hand had been injured on the cursed merchant vessel. He was lying on the floor, his body convulsing violently, foam bubbling at the corners of his mouth. His eyes were wide open, but they stared up at the ceiling with a glassy, unfocused gaze. His skin had taken on a sickly pallor, and sweat poured off of him in rivulets. "What's happening to him?" I demanded, kneeling beside the man. The crew around me exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to respond. One of them, a young lad named Fletcher, spoke up.
"He was fine earlier, Captain," Fletcher stammered. But then, just a little while ago, he started shaking and groaning like this. We tried to hold him down, but he just..."
I didn't need to hear the rest. I could see it in their eyes. The fear that had taken root in their hearts. Johnson's seizures intensified, his body arching off the floor as if some unseen force was trying to rip him apart from the inside. The men backed away, crossing themselves or muttering prayers under their breath. "Hold him still," I ordered, trying to grab Johnson's thrashing arms. But it was no use. This man was beyond help, his strength fueled by whatever foul curse had taken a hold of him. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the convulsing ceased. Johnson's body went limp, and his head lolled to the side, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. The men stood frozen, waiting for some sign that he would recover. But the sign never came. Johnson let out one last wheezing breath, and then nothing. He was gone. For a long moment no one spoke. The only sound was the creaking of the ship and the distant crash of waves against the hull. Finally, I reached out and gently lifted Johnson's lifeless hand. The bandage was soaked through with blood, and as I unwrapped it, I saw what had escaped my notice before. The cuts on his fingers had festered, the flesh around them swollen and blackened. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. The edges of the wounds were ragged, torn, not the clean slices of a blade or a nail. They looked like they had been gnawed upon, as if something had tried to take a bite out of him. I turned his hand over, examining the injury more closely. The men around me leaned in, their faces etched with horror. "That's no ordinary wound," Black Jack muttered, his voice low. "It's like something bit him." "Bitten by what?" I snapped, though I knew no answer would come. The wound was like nothing I'd seen before, except in a bar fight. Too large to be a rat, too deep to be caused by any creature that should have been on board. "Was he near anything when it happened?" I asked, looking around at the men. "Anything strange?" The silence that followed was thick with uncertainty. Finally, Fletcher spoke up again, his voice trembling.
"He was the last one up, Captain, but before I left, I saw him rummaging around the corpses, going through their pockets. I don't know what it was, but I heard something growl down there, and then he yelped, and then I heard a bang, and then he came up with his hand hurt." I looked down at Johnson's lifeless body, the cold dread settling deeper into my bones.
The cursed merchant ship, the bodies in the hold, the Albatross.
Wrap him in a canvas, and we'll give him to the sea in the morning. We don't need his spirit haunting us too.
The men hesitated but followed my orders, lifting Johnson's body with grim faces. As they carried him away, I remained silent, staring at the bloodied bandage in my hand. Whatever had bitten Johnson, whatever had killed him, was still out there. Or worse, it had come aboard our ship. September 18th, 1724. Sleep was a fleeting luxury that night. I tried to close my eyes, focusing my mind to drown out the horrors of the day. The groans of Johnson's final moments still echoed in my ears, and the sight of his mutilated hand was burned into my memory. But I knew I had to keep my wits about me. Panic would only spread like wildfire amongst my men if their captain showed fear. I told the crew to calm themselves, promising that we would make sense of it all in the morning. Perhaps it was some disease that had taken hold. Perhaps the wounds had festered more than we'd realized. There had to be an explanation, something rational amidst all this madness. But deep down I knew better. The omens had been clear enough. Still, I eventually drifted into a restless sleep, though it was more of a state of unconsciousness than any true rest. The creaking of the ship and the distant sounds of waves lulled me into a false sense of peace, if only for a few hours. But peace, it seemed, was not in the cards for us. I awoke to the sounds of screams, high-pitched, desperate screams that tore through the early morning darkness like a jagged knife. My heart lurched in my chest, and before I fully knew what was happening, I was out of my bunk and charging towards the deck, pistol in hand. The scene that greeted me was pure chaos. The men were scattered across the deck, some armed with cutlasses, others with anything they could find. Belaying pins, wooden planks, even bare fists. And at the center of it all was a sight that defied all reason. Johnson. Or what had once been Johnson. He stood lurched over, his skin a sickly grey, his eyes milky and vacant. His jaw was slack, and blood dripped from his mouth, staining the front of his shirt. His hands, those same hands that had been lifeless just hours before, were now bones, gripping at one of the men he had snarled and bit down with a feral intensity. 3 men already lay dead at his feet, their throats torn open, their bodies limp and pale, their blood pooled on the deck, mixing with the salt spray of the sea. The sight of it turned my stomach, but I forced the bile down, knowing that I had no time to be sick.
"Get back!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Get back, all of you!" The men scrambled away from Johnson. No, from the thing that had once been Johnson. It was no longer the man we knew. It was something else entirely. Something accursed. Something monstrous. Johnson, or the creature, lifted its head at the sound of my voice, those dead eyes fixing on me with a hunger that sent a shiver down my spine. His or its mouth curled into a grotesque sneer, blood-streaked bare teeth as it lunged toward me. I raised my pistol without thinking, my instincts honed by years of combat. The shot rang out, loud and final in the early morning quiet. The bullet struck Johnson square in the chest, knocking him back. But he did not fall. Instead, he staggered, as if momentarily stunned, before righting himself and letting out a low, guttural growl. I fired again, this time aiming for his head. The shot hit true, and with a sickening crack, Johnson's skull caved in, sending him crashing onto the deck. He twitched once, twice, and then lay still. The silence that followed was deafening,
I stood there, pistol raised, staring down at the body, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The men around me were frozen, their faces etched with horror. No one spoke. No one moved. Finally, I lowered my weapon, my hand shaking. Is everyone else? I began, but my voice trailed off as I looked around the deck. 3 men lay dead, their throats and chests ripped open, blood soaking their clothes. The others who had been bitten or scratched clutched their wounds, their eyes wide with terror. "We need to get rid of the bodies," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to remain calm. "Throw them overboard. All of them. Now!" The men hesitated, but my order spurred them into action. They moved quickly, lifting the lifeless bodies and dragging them to the side of the ship. One by one they were tossed into the sea, the dark waters swallowing them whole. As the last of the dead was cast overboard, I turned to my remaining crew, my mind racing. "And those of you who were bitten, or scratched, come with me." The dawn was only just breaking, casting a pale, ghostly light over the deck as I led the bitten men to the brig. My pistol was drawn, the cold weight of it heavy in my hand, and the crew followed behind me, their faces etched with confusion and fear. They whispered amongst themselves, questioning what I was doing, why I was treating their shipmates like prisoners, but I gave no answer, as is my right.
"Captain, what's this about?"
One of them, a stout fellow named Briggs, asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty.
"They're our own, ain't they? Just hurt us all."
I stopped and turned to face him, my eyes hard. "They're hurt, aye, but they're also cursed, and I won't have more men lost to whatever devilry took hold of Johnson. Now, get below and do as you're told." He hesitated, glancing back at the men I was leading to the brig, but the steel in my voice silenced him. He gave a reluctant nod and fell back into line. The others followed suit, though I could see the doubt flickering in their eyes. We reached the brig, a damp and foul-smelling compartment below deck, barely big enough to hold the 6 men I'd collared. They looked at me with a mix of fear and confusion as I ordered them inside, locking the heavy iron gate behind them.
"What's happening, Captain? You think we'll end up like Johnson? Do you?"
I didn't answer, just staring at them through the bars, my mind racing. I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were too clear. The wounds, the seizures, the way Johnson had risen from the dead like some nightmare from a sailor's tale. I couldn't take any chances. Not now. Not with the lives of the rest of my crew hanging in the balance. "Stay here," I said, my voice cold. "Don't move. Don't speak. And for the love of God, don't try anything foolish." Turning to the rest of the crew, I barked my orders. "No one is to leave this deck, except for Black Jack. He'll make sure we stay on course. The rest of you stay close to me and watch." They looked at me like I'd gone mad, but none dared disobey. The tension was thick as Black Jack slipped away, and we all stood there in silence, waiting for the inevitable. Hours dragged by, each minute heavier than the last. It wasn't long before the groaning started again. At first, it was just Fletcher, his body twitching uncontrollably in the confined space of the brig, his eyes rolled back in his head, his mouth foaming just like Johnson's had. The others backed away from him as much as the cramped quarters would allow, panic rising in their voices.
"Captain, do something!"
Briggs shouted, his voice breaking.
"We can't just let him die!"
But I didn't move. My hand tightened around the pistol, my jaw clenched so hard it hurt. I knew what was coming, and I couldn't stop it. One by one, the others followed, their bodies convulsing violently, their breathing becoming ragged, their eyes wide with terror as they clutched at their wounds. It was a grotesque spectacle, watching men you had sailed with, fought with, transformed into something monstrous before your eyes. Briggs made a move towards the brig, his face twisted in desperation.
"Captain, for the love of God, let's help them!"
"Stay where you are!" I barked, raising my pistol and aiming it squarely at him. The shock on his face was plain, but I couldn't risk any of them getting close. "We'll do nothing until we know what we're dealing with." Reluctantly, he stepped back, and the men around him followed suit. Their faces were a mixture of disbelief and growing horror. It didn't take too long. The seizures reached their peak, then stopped abruptly. Silence fell over the ship once more, broken only by the creaking of the timbers and the faint, distant sound of waves. The 6 men still lay in the brig, their bodies lifeless, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. For a brief, fleeting moment, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps it had ended there, that maybe the curse, or disease, or whatever dark magic it was, had died with them. But then, slowly, one of the bodies began to move. Fletcher's corpse twitched, his limbs moving unnaturally as if being pulled by invisible strings. His head lolled to the side, his dead eyes fixating on all of us through the bars. And then, with a low growl, he rose to his feet, his mouth twisted into a grotesque snarl. The others followed suit, their bodies stiff and awkward, their movements unnatural. They were no longer men. They were creatures of pure hunger and fury, driven by some dark force that had no place in this world. They lunged at the bars, their blood-stained fingers clawing through the iron, snapping their jaws as they tried to get at us. The crew recoiled in horror, some of them crying out in fear, others crossing themselves and muttering prayers under their breaths again. "Get back!" I shouted, stepping forward and raising my pistol. "Away from the bars!" With a shaking hand, I took aim at Fletcher, his snarling face contorted with rage and hunger. The first shot rang out, echoing in the confined space, and his head snapped back as the bullet tore through his skull. He collapsed to the floor, lifeless once more. One by one, I put the others down, each shot driving a sickening sense of finality into my chest. When it was over, the brig was silent once again, the bodies of my former crew lying still and broken. I stood there for a moment, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air, my hand trembling as I lowered the pistol. The crew around me were silent, their faces pale, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "Get them overboard," I said, my voice hoarse. "Every last one of them. We don't leave a trace of this madness on our ship." They moved without a word, dragging the lifeless bodies from the brig and heaving them over the side into the cold embrace of the sea. I watched them go, the dark water swallowing them up, and felt a cold emptiness settle into my bones. As the last body disappeared beneath the waves, I turned back to the crew, their faces still etched with fear. "This curse is behind us now," I said, though the words felt hollow. "We'll sail on, and by God we'll survive this. But mark my words, no one speaks of this again." They nodded, though the haunted look in their eyes told me none of them would forget it. We returned to our duties, but the ship felt different, quieter, darker, as if the very wood had absorbed the horror of the days past. And as I stood at the helm, staring out at the endless horizon,
I couldn't shake the feeling that the sea held more secrets yet to come. Secrets that may yet be our end.